So I'm just going to run through this article that Didi pointed out today, which is some very unfortunate laws that are being introduced by the Australian government, and they're in relation to charities. They're going to try and suppress any kind of protests or voices out from those charities that are trying to change the way the government functions in relation to the whatever group they're looking after. Basically, any sort of dissent from a charity they'll be deregistered off the charity list. So this article in The Guardian explains that, so I was just going to go through it and also make some commentary about some associated issues with that. So thanks for watching. Check this out. So Didi pointed this out to me today, and it's a very disturbing development. Coalition accused of using charity crackdown to silence dissent. New rules on offences that can cause charities to be deregistered are, quote, unprecedented, end quote, and could stop them speaking out, critics say. And this is by Daniel Hurst in The Guardian. Australian charities fear a looming crackdown on the sector could silence their advocacy work, despite the Morrison government watering down several elements of its initial plans. Labor accused the coalition of seeking to, quote, shut down dissenting voices, end quote, after the government introduced new regulations to expand the types of offences for which charities could be deregistered. The government said the new regulations announced on Friday, after months of controversy over the proposed changes, would reinforce trust and confidence in the sector. They would empower the regulator to investigate charities engaging in or promoting serious unlawful acts of trespass, vandalism, theft, or assault and threatening behaviour. Now, this is interesting, this particular development, because like over in the UK, they've just passed some anti-protest laws which are really outrageous and incredibly fascistic. And I'll talk about that in another video, but also in the US, they're bringing in some laws. I don't know if they've already brought them in, but they're bringing in some laws which I've spoken about yesterday, and one in particular basically makes being an anti-capitalist illegal. It considers people who are against capitalism, it considers them domestic violent extremists. It also places environmentalists under that same category, and also I've talked about the whole animal rights thing and my issue with that particular word in relation to what these particular groups are doing. But anyway, putting that aside, you can look at my video from yesterday. Putting that aside, animal rights groups are being targeted as well, and sort of anti-capitalists and other ideologies. Anything basically that's challenging the power of the state is going to affect the capitalist class in some way. So anyway, continuing with this will apply regardless of whether they are classified as an indictable offence or the less serious category of summary offences under state and territory laws. The government made several changes to its original proposal after facing a backlash from the sector, including narrowing the scope of the summary offences that are captured. The regulations will also prohibit charities from using their resource, including social media accounts, to, quote, actively promote, end quote, others to engage in unlawful activities. This places the wording in the original proposal that charities must not use their resources to, quote, promote or support, end quote, such activities. Last month, a group of not-for-profit and philanthropy experts warned that the planned crackdown would muzzle the charity sector, restrict dissent, and stifle political advocacy. And you can see that already. You can see that already quietens down various groups anyway. I've noticed that, for example, groups like, there's a whole number of reasons why they do this, because some reasons are they don't want to challenge the public and they want them to give them donations. So you'll have, for example, a group like Welcome to Australia, and I've mentioned that group before that is in Australia, and it's about welcoming asylum seekers to Australia, which is a really good idea. But the thing is that they never ever seem to address the causes of those asylum seekers and refugees flooding to our country by very dangerous means, by boat, really rickety boats. They risk their life to get away from countries that we, the Western imperialists, have invaded and overthrown whatever governments they've had, basically invaded them and destroyed most of their country and stolen their resources. That's what those particular asylum seekers and refugees are escaping and fleeing to our country, Australia. And they have the right to do so. We basically set their house on fire. Then when they run out and try to, get safety in our house, they are vilified and detained indefinitely on these various detention centres. So, but if we're not going to address the cause of these things, which is something that I see over and over and over again, the causes of these various situations with asylum seekers, there's literally, 70 or 80 million asylum seekers. They're displaced from their country because of Western imperialism. Look at what the Biden administration just did today, bombing Syria and so-called Iranian-backed militias or whatever, using that as an excuse to bomb Syria. And this is what they do. This is any country that has not submitted to U.S. empire is going to be the target of U.S. empire until they succeed. But anyway, I'm getting away from this point. But I just wanted to point out that a lot of charities today do not talk about the causes of the things that they're actually trying to address, and I find that so bizarre. I mean, a lot of things that happen with domestic violence, the gender-based, messed up sort of gender stereotypes that we have that cause a lot of violence. I'm talking about male gender stereotypes and toxic masculinity. That causes a lot of violence, which ends up causing a lot of violence towards women. It ends up contributing to imperialism, people joining wars, all that kind of thing, nationalism. There's so many things that come from abusive sort of stereotypes that imprison children in kind of ways of being where they're not talking about their feelings. They're told to toughen up, do not cry. You're not supposed to be like this. You're supposed to be like that. These undertones of there's something wrong with you if you're not, if you're gay or you're non-binary or whatever. All the different vilifications of children because they're not this, because they're not that. That is a whole lot of problems stem from that, and that's something we've talked about on this channel. So anyway, back to this. So, and this is going to have a very, very, even more of a dampening effect if different charities weren't speaking about causes of things because they didn't want to challenge people too much and they wanted donations. Well, this is actually going to even compound that even more. Before I go on, I probably didn't explain that last bit very well because it's a complex issue, but I think you get my drift about what I'm talking about with these very, very restrictive binary roles that children are put in. And even though we say that we've progressed past them and stuff, I don't really see that. I don't really see that we've actually moved very far with this restrictive binary, genders and the roles that have been going on now for a very, very long time. I don't see that really a whole lot has changed. It's all sort of a veneer, which is often the case with a lot of things. There's all the sort of a lot of what is spoken about is often there's a thin veneer, and underneath there's still so much misogyny, a whole lot of things going on. But anyway, charity sector insiders who have examined the latest version of regulations told Guardian Australia the regulations could empower the regulator to deregister charities for encouraging people to attend peaceful protests, including protests on public land. They cited the example of a rally being unauthorised and blocking traffic, or if people remain on the site after being asked to move on. It's amazing now how you need, in Australia you need permission, in other Western countries you need permission to do a street protest. I mean, it starts to become so mealy-mouthed and namby-pamby, the whole thing, that you have to ask permission from the powers that be if you can protest them. I've sort of really believed that we have to really start economically hitting these institutions of power in the pocket, meaning like general strikes. There really needs to be something that is beyond just protesting. I'm for nonviolence, and I think protests are very good, but there needs to be something that really hits them in the hip pocket. That's why boycott, divestments and sanctions against apartheid Israel is something that is actually affecting them to the point it's affecting the apartheid state of Israel so badly that they're trying to demonize and outlaw any sort of boycott, divestments and sanctions in various countries, and then trying to frame it as anti-Semitic, which is ridiculous. So anyway, sources said both situations were common, and rally authorizations often came at very late notice, meaning it would make it more difficult for charities to promote attendance at a rally or permit their staff to attend. The sector also fears the proposal could be used to shut down charities that fail to police community members that use a Charities Facebook to organise a peaceful protest, such as a sit-in at the PM's office, at the MP's office. Alice Drury, a senior lawyer at the Human Rights Law Centre, said the government's proposal would, quote, silence important advocacy by Australian charities. Quote, this treatment of charities is punitive and unprecedented. No business or political party faces deregistration for minor breaches of the law, end quote. Drury said, quote, nor are other entities preemptively punished because of what the regulator thinks they might do in the future. The government's explanatory notes say the Commissioner of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission can consider action if they reasonably believe that a registered charity has not complied with the new provisions, quote, or it is more likely than not that a registered entity will not comply with these provisions, end quote. Drury said the move came at a time when charities had worked to support communities through unprecedented crises, from bushfires and floods to an economic recession and a pandemic. Quote, the Morrison government should be supporting charities and welcoming our advocacy, not threatening us with new rules that could shut us down for speaking out, end quote, Drury said. The Assistant Treasurer, Michael Secure, said the nation's 59,000 registered charities performed exceptional work supporting society's most vulnerable, but the new governance standards, quote, ensure charities that misuse and take advantage of their status to take part in or actively promote illegal activity can be stripped of tax concessions and other benefits, end quote. The government argues the regulations, quote, do not impose a new burden on charities that are already complying with the Australian laws, end quote. God, how fascistic does all this sound? It says charities, quote, will be able to participate in advocacy activities provided they are consistent with their charitable purpose and conducted lawfully. But the acting chief executive of the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, George Salvanera, said the proposed changes would, quote, jeopardise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, end quote, communities' self-determination, end quote. Quote, already marginalised communities will be cut off from vital support because charitable organisations will not be able to provide the full extent of their services out of fear that the government will weaponise the proposed charity regulations, end quote, Salvanera said. Yes, there'll be no land rights protests or anything like that. It's just that's going to basically further oppress Indigenous people. And if you're actually in a group like what Jerry Georgatis, his efforts are to address the Indigenous suicides, which are like 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds, and trying to get the government to address that. Well, would that be seen as something that, if he had a charity, would that be something that was seen as, and he may have a charity, I'm not sure, would that be enough for the government to deregister that charity? To be sort of criticising the government. I mean, this is sort of, for all that these Western countries, our Western countries, go around sort of pointing the finger at all these other countries saying, you're a dictator, you're authoritarian, you're this and you're that. I mean, look at this sort of behaviour. And look at and of course the same, we should be pointing the finger back at ourselves, because look at what we're doing around the world, basically trying to overthrow other countries and with their democratically elected leaders, and then stealing their resources. I mean, talk about parasites. Western imperialist governments are just parasitic, insatiable, warmongers going around trying to steal resources from other countries and obtain full spectrum dominance. And ultimately, that is the aim of the US government, the US empire, is to have full spectrum dominance by any means necessary. And I mean that literally, by any means necessary. So, quote, Aboriginal community-controlled organisations could be silenced with their engagement in public debate curtailed, end quote. The opposition spokesperson for Charities, Andrew Lee, said the coalition had, quote, waged a war on charities, end quote, over the past 8 years, including a failed past attempt to scrap the Charities Commission altogether. And by the way, just looking at the idea of charity, a lot of what a lot of charities are doing now, and this is the same in the US, is they're doing what the government was actually is supposed to do. The government, they are public servants, and they are supposed to serve the public. They have Western governments have sovereign economies. The only constraints are resources. They could actually address homelessness. They could basically fix homelessness in the United States. They could fix any homelessness that is here, which is becoming more and more of a problem as neoliberalism continues. So, these charities are taking up the slack of what the government is not doing and should be doing. And a lot of those it's like the non-profit industrial complex. There's a lot of charities. They're often religious charities that are making money. They're being given lots of money by the government. They're lining their pockets and doing what the government should be doing, but they're actually making money from it. So I have a real problem with this more outsourcing of what the government should be doing. They're giving to charities that end up making their own kind of money from the suffering of others, the suffering of the public that shouldn't be suffering. They shouldn't have to be working 2 jobs or being unhoused. The internal refugee crisis, basically, of the unhoused, because rents are so insane. Everything is food is getting more expensive. Rents are outrageous in Australia, and they are in the United States. And then you get like, for example, in the United States with the evictions, then you end up with a whole lot of unhoused homeless people that through no fault of their own during a COVID pandemic, then their houses are bought up by BlackRock and that kind of those predatory institutions that basically delight in evictions and buy up all these homes and then sell them at some outrageous price and basically end up gentrifying those areas, because the very people that were ousted during this COVID pandemic, they cannot buy back into their neighborhoods because all these houses have been bought up and then sold at outrageous prices. So it's it's pillaging at home, it's pillaging overseas. What happens in other countries by Western imperialist countries happens back in our own countries. That's something that people need to wake up to, and I don't think it's quite clicked for a lot of people, but basically you cannot have something going on in another country, another injustice in another country done by our countries, and it doesn't at some point come back to visit us. Anyway, so Lee said the coalition wanted charities to be, quote, seen and not heard, end quote. Quote, when the government first introduced these governance changes, they claimed they were cracking down on criminals masquerading as activist charities, end quote, Lee said. Quote, yet in the past 4 years, just 2 out of 59,000 charities have been disqualified for breaking the law. There is no charity crime wave that needs an urgent solution, end quote. Lee said charities that broke the law could already be deregistered, and the new regulation, quote, merely gives Liberals a new set of tools to shut down dissenting voices, end quote. Now, the Liberal government here is actually a neoconservative government. It's not that, different countries have a different meaning for that, but the Labor Party is also a neoliberal party, and I think they're pushing back somewhat on this, but, they really, you can just tell with the Albanese, he's the opposition leader, that he does the very least he can, really. For example, just recently, this is getting off the topic a little bit, but recently further cuts to Medicare is intended, where they're going to basically cut out Medicare rebates for hip surgery, for ankle surgery, for knee surgery, which is a lot of people will be affected by that, and they'll have to be out of pocket themselves for that. Now, in the United States, that's a common thing for people to be having to pay ridiculous health insurance premiums, which don't really cover them, and they end up that they can't even use those health insurance premiums in the United States because they're so restrictive. But here in Australia, we still have some form of free healthcare, and both sides are really not very helpful. But the neoconservative government here, the Morrison government, are doing their best to have, to basically death by 1,000 cuts, take away any sort of free healthcare from Australians, and basically make sure that we have to have health insurance. For example, I had to get health insurance about 25 years ago because I had a health issue that required a surgery, and And I was basically, I had to wait, I was on a waiting list for 18 months. They make it so that public hospitals are underfunded, and then you end up on waiting lists forever and a day. And it's dreadful, and it's only gotten worse. But that was 25 years ago. And I ended up having to get my parents to help me out. And I think I'm not sure exactly, I think they helped me out with their own insurance. I'm not sure how that worked. But anyway, they helped me out with that particular thing, because I was, it was getting to the point where it was, I was thinking, God, when is this going to happen? When am I going to be able to have it? It was just a minor kind of a surgery, but it was important. So, that's how it is. They're trying to end up making Australia just like the US health system. That's what they want. And they've been doing the same thing in the United Kingdom. They've been working on destroying the National Health Scheme, the National Health Service in the in the UK, since the 80s, since neoliberalism started coming in. That's a fact when you actually watch. I haven't watched John Pilger's documentary on the NHS, but that was the point of that, showing how they had deliberately tried to dismantle that system, so that eventually UK citizens will not have any sort of free healthcare. And they've been, running the hospitals down. But that's by the by. But I'm just sort of pointing out something that's just happened recently, and that how you have mealy-mouthed Labor politicians who do a bit of pushback, but really, in many ways, they end up being okay with what happens. It's much better. It's much easier for them if they don't push back too much on corporations, and then that will help them get re-elected, and that whole neoliberal slide continues. The government's explanatory notes argue the changes are needed because under Australia's system of government, the states and territories determine whether unlawful activities are classified as indictable or summary offences. Quote, this has resulted in potentially serious offences such as trespass, vandalism, theft, assault, and threatening harm to persons being defined as summary offences in some jurisdictions, quote, end quote, the note says. Sukar's office said Charities would, quote, be required to maintain reasonable internal controls over their resources, such as their funds, social media accounts, and employees, to ensure they do not use them to actively promote others to commit offences. So thanks so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, please hit the subscribe button, the notifications bell, and so you get all notifications. And please join my Substack. Just search for Faint Signals from Vega on substack.com, and so you'll always get notifications when there's a video drop. So thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye for now.